I was going to ask a question about sort of the ever-changing field of science as we know it. Like we usually like to think that science is sort of a black and white sort of thing. Like, there are absolutes, like this scientific paper means that, this is the gospel, so to speak, or like this is just the way, to be. And we have to acknowledge, that's another extra issue we have to understand in this field, is that science isn't always an absolute either. So it may be changing. And within that, I think we have to also consider uh, biases, the bias of the person making the paper, making the research, making the recommendations, making the standards of practice, whatever it may be. And then our own personal biases that come up around, almost anything, like this particular disease process, this particular person, this particular whatever. So it's a challenging, space to hold, as mentioned. And I think that personally, I always feel like I have to be sort of appropriately self-critical in all these different ways. Like I have to sort of, you can't be always be perfect, but you gotta, time to time critique your practice or critique yourself. And even whatever whatever model you use to treat, whatever
Yeah.
that may be as well. So
Yeah.
if you'd like to comment on some of that, I just wanted to bring that up because I think it's an interesting topic.
I love it. I love it. And there's so many juicy things in that one sort of question to unpack.
Yeah.
I totally agree with you. I think, and especially, from having been in the lab and been in on the research side of things, I feel like I've had this really unique opportunity to see how deeply biased the scientific community is, right? We're not publishing articles on negative results. And there are big meta studies that are showing that we are not publishing broadly as a community all of our results. We're only publishing our positive results, which means we're missing all of this information. No one's publishing, oh, I designed this experiment, it didn't work, right? Because you don't get grant money for projects that fail, but that's important information that is not going into sort of the scientific record. Also, I mean, the fact that the scientific community is very isolated, labs are not sharing information, it is competitive, you're competing for the same little pots of money. The people reviewing your papers are your peers, you know who they are, it's supposed to be enough. I mean, there's so much. And then the politics, right? There's a ton to it. And then if we step back even a layer further, we go, okay, well, how about the cells that we're using to do our studies on, right? We're using all these immortalized cell lines. We're using all these breast cancer cells, right? The HeLa cells, the Henrietta Lacks cells that we've been using since we harvested those without her family's consent, decades ago. Well, an immortalized breast cancer cell is going to behave very differently than any other cellular system in our bodies. So we're running all these experiments on cells that we know behave abnormally, and then we're expecting to extrapolate that and apply it to non-immortalized organism is insane. And we know that. And we have the published articles saying, well, we really shouldn't be using these cells, but we don't have anything else to use. And they're easy and you can buy them from a catalog. So when you are in the scientific world in the way that I was for so long, and in that academic, my experience was peer pressured to fall rank in line with what we as a scientific community accept. And there was not a lot of room to think or look outside sort of that dominant paradigm, which is exactly what you and I struggle with all the time, is that, well, there is so much more outside of that paradigm. And there is so much more once you kind of start exploring it, right? So once I kind of lifted the blinders in regards to, I didn't want this career in research. And I also didn't really think that the way that science was being presented to the world at large was as fair and as unbiased as it could be, but at least we're trying, right? At least we're trying. I felt like I had this moment where I could step back and be a little more critical of the scientific community, but I still didn't really have a platform to talk about it, right? And well, I left the scientific community, went back to medical school, and then I got into the clinical world. And in the clinical world, all the time, as you know, we're being asked, well, do we have the studies to back that up? Well, you and I know in our world, there is no funding for the studies that would actually support what we're doing in a way that is interesting or relevant, because there's not money to be made off we're not doing any solo one thing, right? We're always working with all the different organ systems. We're working with nutrition and lifestyle and stress before we even start bringing on board supplements or looking at labs. So you can't design a study that isolates those variables in the way that the scientific world wants. I outgrew the idea of feeling like I needed a study, or I needed to prove things to people, or I needed to demonstrate, or I feel like I've hit a point where I've been doing this long enough and I see our outcomes every day, where I don't, I just say like, well, I've seen this work, or I know that, I have confidence in this. So let's give it a try. And if it doesn't, we can come back to it. You have to step outside of this idea that there's only one way to examine the world. But even then, the scientific community, the whole idea of science is that it is a way to question what's going on around you, right? And it's not actually the theories or the dogmas or what you come out on the other side with. The whole kind of idea of being a rigorous scientist is that you're applying this critical thinking. You're going in, you're saying you've got this question, you're going to design a way to frame that so that you can really try to isolate just that question and address it. I think as naturopaths, what makes us so unique is that we have our naturopathic philosophy, which is very similar. It's not quite as geared toward critical thinking in the way that we kind of think of like the, designing a hypothesis and scientific theory is. But if you look at what unites all of us naturopaths, it is not our protocols or our beliefs or our lab testing. It's that we were all trained with this same philosophy. And while I was in school, I thought philosophy was like one of my most boring classes, right? Because I wanted to be doing the more interesting stuff. But the philosophy is what I think gives us our uniqueness, our creativity. I'm going to even see if I can repeat our tenets off to you. I know doctor is teacher, right? So education is huge for us. What are our other tenets, Jamie?
Treat the whole person.
Treat the whole person. Okay. So that one's super important. Remove the obstacle to cure, right? Whatever got that person sick, get them out of that circumstance. And if at the end of the day, I feel like any case we have, if you remove all of our different tools and you kind of come back to our naturopathic philosophy, you can make progress, which is amazing and lovely and gorgeous. And I think that's what is so exciting about naturopathic medicine, is that that fundamental training of what we all share is what's going to keep us interested and going.
Yeah, that foundation is so important. And I think it leads to more success in practice ultimately, because we're kind of always asking these questions when we're connecting the dots. We're connecting a lot of these complex systems together, and we're looking at their history. We're looking at etiology, pathogenesis, how a disease forms and starts, It's a really complicated process. And I think that the conventional science model of what's considered accepted research isn't able to really integrate this. It's very idealistic. Like, you can sort of simplify this process down to something that's black and white. There's double-blind, placebo-controlled, trials for these things as an example, and that's the gold standard.
Yeah.
But in clinical science, it's way more complicated than that, and they say even that bench science lags about 10 years into clinical. And I think one of the reasons is that there's a lot of complexity in even integrating something that is found to be quote unquote true or exciting or appropriate within the clinical bench science interface of scientific papers and double-blind, placebo-controlled and all that kind of thing. So yeah, it's a very idealistic process. It just tries to sort of, fit everything into a nice box. But as clinicians, we have to think about a lot of things at any given time. And so, anecdote becomes kind of important. And I think case studies do become kind of important. I think that case studies should be taken as valid, or, that they're an important part of the process. And then they're supposed to lead then to the scientific papers, double checking them and stuff. But that's where we get ideas. And so we have to be innovative. We have to be pioneers to a degree. We have to really figure out how to kind of live on that. And of course, in the name of safety, safety is the biggest, critique of naturopathic medicine and this philosophy of medicine.